Listen carefully. The sound you hear isn't the snap of a whip cutting through humid air. It's the soft scrape of fountain pen on parchment, the dry rustle of a ledger being closed in a candlelit office. Picture 19th century America. Men in pressed waistcoats lean over polished oak desks, running their fingers down columns of numbers. They calculate yields. They project growth. They invest in a brand new commodity that no European exchange had ever traded before. Not cotton, not tobacco, not iron or grain. They traded the breath inside a womb. They traded children who did not yet exist. In AD 1808, the United States Congress shut the door on the Atlantic slave trade. On paper, it looked like a moral awakening. In practice, it was a math problem. The plantation economy was hungry, and the supply line from across the ocean had just been severed. The men who ran the Cotton Kingdom were not going to let their fortunes wither. They simply turned around. They looked at the women already in their fields, already in their kitchens, already chained to their estates. And they saw something the world had never put a price on with such cold precision: a renewable resource. This was not slavery limping forward out of habit. This was slavery refined, industrialized, engineered with the same logic that built railroads and steel mills. Virginia, Maryland, the Carolinas. Their tobacco soil was bleeding out, drained by 200 years of greedy planting. Most of those estates should have collapsed. They didn't. They were reborn. Reborn as something far more sinister than any farm. They became human factories. The crop was no longer leaves or grain. The crop was infants, and the women who carried them were stripped of every shred of personhood and recategorized in plantation records as livestock. Stock to be measured. Stock to be paired. Stock to be replenished. Overseers carried clipboards instead of just whips now. They tracked menstrual cycles. They set quotas. They reported numbers up the chain like factory foremen reporting widget counts to a supervisor in Boston. And this was not some perversion happening in the shadows. This was not a few cruel men acting alone. This was a national infrastructure, sanctioned, defended, profitable. And here is the part that crawls under the skin and refuses to leave. The worst evidence is not in the dirt of those plantations. It is sitting, right now, in the archives of America's most prestigious institutions. Universities you've heard of, hospitals you trust. Physicians published papers in respected medical journals on how to optimize a woman's reproductive cycle for maximum output. Judges in courtrooms ruled on cases where infertility was treated like a defective product, a buyer demanding a refund. The most powerful banks on Wall Street accepted the swollen bellies of enslaved women as collateral against loans. And the same insurance companies whose names still hang on glass skyscrapers in Manhattan today wrote policies on babies who had not yet drawn a single breath. This is the story they don't put in the textbooks. The slave-breeding farms of America. A nightmare wrapped in paperwork. A genocide measured in spreadsheets. Human life manufactured, inventoried, mortgaged, and monetized to build the wealthiest economy the world had ever seen. Before we go any deeper, drop a comment below and tell us which city and which country you are watching from right now. Hit that subscribe button and support the project. You are watching Ancestral, the best dark history channel in the world. The year is AD 1808. Inside the United States Congress, a piece of legislation is signed into law that severs the transatlantic slave trade for good. From that moment forward, the great wooden ships that had spent 2 centuries hauling chained bodies from the coasts of West Africa become outlaws on the open sea. The Atlantic falls strangely silent. In the parlors of New England, abolitionists raise glasses of port. They believe they have just driven a stake through the heart of American slavery. They are convinced that without a constant resupply of human cargo from across the ocean, the entire plantation system will starve to death within a generation. They could not have been more wrong. They underestimated something they should have studied more closely: the cold, surgical adaptability of American capital. The end of the foreign trade did not cripple the market. It created something far more dangerous: a closed domestic monopoly, a market where the only suppliers were already inside the country, and the only direction prices could move was up. Down in the deep South, a sleeping giant had just opened its eyes. A simple invention, the cotton gin, had quietly rewritten the rules of agriculture. Short staple cotton, once a frustrating crop that swallowed labor and returned little, had transformed into something planters were now calling white gold. Across Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and the newly purchased Louisiana Territory, millions of acres of dark, virgin soil were being torn open by plows. The land seemed to stretch on forever. And in the textile mills of Manchester, in the dye houses of Liverpool, the British appetite for cotton was bottomless. Southern planters had everything they needed to become the richest men in the Western Hemisphere: land, climate, markets, capital. They were missing only one thing: hands. They needed bodies in those fields, and they needed them yesterday. On the open market, the price of a single human being began to climb like a fever chart. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles to the north, the founding states were dying. In Virginia, in Maryland, the soil itself was breathing its last. 200 years of relentless tobacco cultivation had bled the land dry. Tobacco is a thief. It steals nitrogen from the ground with a kind of slow, methodical greed. By 1808, the great founding plantations, the same estates that had produced presidents and senators and signers of the Declaration, were cracking apart under mountains of debt. The aristocrats who owned them sat in echoing colonial mansions, staring through wavy glass windows at fields that produced nothing. They still owned hundreds, sometimes thousands, of enslaved people. But there was no longer any crop worth growing. The old model had collapsed. And then came the pivot. It was not born of cruelty in the heat of the moment. It was worse than that. It was a calculation, cold, quiet, made by gentlemen in waistcoats at polished mahogany desks, with quill pens and steaming cups of coffee at their elbows. The Virginia planters read the auction reports coming out of New Orleans. They saw the prices. Then they looked out their windows at the men, women, and children standing in the ruins of their tobacco fields, with nothing to do. And it hit them all at once, like a revelation. They no longer needed to grow tobacco. They no longer needed to grow anything that came out of the ground. They could grow people. This was the true birth of what historians would later call the Second Middle Passage. But that phrase is far too gentle. What it actually was a biological assembly line stretching across half a continent. Virginia stopped being a tobacco state. It became something the modern world had never seen before: a national breeding ground. The chief export of the Commonwealth was no longer a leaf or a bushel. It was human flesh, packaged in childhood and stamped with a price. The physical structure of the plantation began to mutate to fit its new purpose. The hollow tobacco barns, once filled with hanging leaves drying in the rafters, were swept clean and converted. They became pens. They became cells. Fences rose higher around the property lines. Locks on doors got heavier. Iron foundries in Richmond saw their orders triple. The buildings that had once been the architecture of agriculture were now the architecture of confinement. A farmer who, in his grandfather's day, had studied almanacs to predict the first frost, now sat at his desk studying something else entirely. He was studying menstrual cycles. He was tracking fertility windows. He had become something his ancestors would not have had a word for. The vocabulary inside the ledger books changed completely. Phrases that had once dominated every page, words like harvest, drought, yield per acre, weather pattern, disappeared. In their place came a new language: increase, fecundity, weaning age, breeding capacity. The men running these estates began applying the mathematics of compound interest to human bodies. Thomas Jefferson himself, in private letters never meant for the public eye, did the brutal arithmetic. He concluded that a woman who could produce a child every 2 years was more profitable than the strongest man working the hardest field. The child, you see, was an asset that grew itself. It required almost no investment. A handful of cornmeal, a scrap of cloth. The mother was the machine. The infant was the dividend. The numbers compounded silently, year after year, while the slaveholder sipped wine on his veranda. This was not an outlier opinion. This was the new orthodoxy of the region. Agricultural manuals, written by men with university degrees and printed by respected publishing houses, included entire chapters on the management of pregnant women. Not for their welfare, for asset protection. The texts advised plantation owners on the precise calibration of discipline. Too much punishment, and the woman miscarried. Too little, and she became unproductive. The goal was to find the equilibrium that maximized live births. The market value of a female slave was now directly indexed to her proven track record. A woman who had birthed 4 healthy children was a premium asset, fetching prices that doubled or tripled the standard. A woman who failed to conceive was classified as defective inventory. She was usually sold off to the brutal sugar plantations of southern Louisiana, where the conditions were known to kill workers within a few years. It was, in effect, a death sentence for the crime of barrenness. The overseer evolved into something genuinely new. He was still a man with a whip, yes, but now he carried something more telling: a notebook. He demanded reports from the older enslaved women about who was bleeding and who was late. He logged pregnancies the way a clerk logs shipments. He noted breeding pairs the way a stable manager records bloodlines. The whip was still there, hanging on his hip. But, increasingly, the most dangerous tool he carried was the pencil. Food was no longer about nourishment. It was fuel calculation. The owners had figured out the absolute minimum number of calories required to keep a fetus developing inside a womb. And they fed exactly that. Coarse cornmeal, boiled greens, salted pork that was mostly fat and gristle. No fresh fruit. No milk. No rest. When a woman started to physically break down from back-to-back pregnancies, when her teeth loosened and her hair fell out from severe deficiency, her rations were adjusted upward, not out of mercy. The way a farmer adds a measure of oats to a tired plow horse before sending it back into the field. The family, as a unit, was a threat to the business model, so the business eliminated it. Pairings were arranged from above, dictated by the master, based entirely on physical characteristics. Just like with livestock: height, shoulder breadth, endurance, resistance to malaria and yellow fever. Men identified as exceptional physical specimens were designated as stock men. They were forced to impregnate multiple women, sometimes across multiple plantations. Some were rented out to neighboring estates for a flat stud fee, the way a stallion might be loaned for a season. To refuse meant the whip. To refuse repeatedly meant the auction block. Tenderness, choice, love, all of it had been surgically removed from the equation. What remained was the cold mechanics of reproduction, dictated by columns in a ledger. Pregnancy did not buy a woman a single day of relief. The fields still called. Women in their final trimester were sent out at sunrise to pull weeds, to hoe rows, to clear brush along the property lines. They worked until the contractions started. Some overseers had taken to digging shallow pits in the ground, just deep enough to cradle a pregnant belly. The woman would be ordered to lie face down with her stomach in the hole. Then she would be whipped on the back. The unborn child, the actual asset, would be protected. The mother, who was merely the vessel, was disposable. This level of refinement, this engineering of cruelty, did not exist in the Old World. It was a uniquely American innovation. When the moment of birth finally arrived, it happened in cabins with dirt floors and no windows, sometimes by candlelight, often in darkness. There were no doctors present, because doctors cost money. The midwives were other enslaved women, doing what they could with boiling water, torn strips of fabric, and inherited knowledge passed down in whispers. Mortality was catastrophic. Tetanus, puerperal fever, hemorrhage, infections that would have been treatable with basic sanitation. The owners accepted these losses without flinching. They had built the deaths into the spreadsheet. A certain percentage of mothers would die. A certain percentage of infants would not survive their first month. It was projected and planned for, like spoilage in a warehouse. If a mother bled out on the dirt floor, but her newborn lived, the ledger still showed a profit. The transaction was complete. The instant a child took its first breath, a clock started running. The overseer wrote the date in his book. He assigned the infant a starting valuation, usually around $50. That number would climb every year the child survived. From the very first second of life outside the womb, the baby was collateral against a banker's loan hundreds of miles away. The mother was permitted to nurse, not because the owners cared about bonding, because breast milk was free. It was the most cost-effective method of keeping the asset growing toward market weight. But the clock kept ticking. From the moment of birth, the countdown had begun. The weaning was forced and abrupt, designed to snap the mother back into a fertile state as fast as biologically possible. The faster she could conceive again, the faster the next dividend would be produced. The instant the child could chew solid food, the umbilical relationship was no longer financially necessary. The product was ready for inventory. Try, for a moment, to inhabit the mind of that mother. She knew. From the first flutter of movement in her belly, she knew. The child she was carrying did not belong to her. The child belonged to a man in a fine coat who lived in a house she was not permitted to enter. She knew that every healthy pound her infant gained was 1 pound closer to the auction block. She had to love a child she would lose. She had to feed a child she was preparing for sale. Her own maternal instinct, the deepest and most ancient programming in the human nervous system, was being weaponized against her. Her love was now the unpaid labor that brought the merchandise to market. The average age of separation was around 8 years old. By then, the child was big enough to walk, big enough to be sold for a meaningful sum. The carts came in the pre-dawn darkness, when most of the plantation was still asleep. The children were pulled from the cabins, often without warning. The screams of the mothers were ignored. Mothers who fought were beaten unconscious. Mothers who clung to the wheels of the wagons had their fingers broken by the overseer's boot. Some were locked inside the smokehouse for 2 or 3 days, until the carts were long gone and the dust had settled on the road. When they were finally released, they were expected to return to their duties, to recover, and, within months, to begin breeding again. The most common destination for those carts was a place called Shockoe Bottom in Richmond, Virginia. This was the pulsing, bloody heart of the American domestic slave trade. A district of brick auction houses, holding pens, merchant offices, and grimy taverns crammed along the muddy banks of the James River. The air there had a specific smell: horse sweat, cheap whiskey, river mud, and underneath all of it, the unmistakable sour smell of human fear. Dozens of competing firms ran their operations in Shockoe Bottom, undercutting each other on prices, racing each other to deliver fresh stock to the southern markets. The traders prepared the merchandise with surgical care. The captives were stripped and scrubbed in cold river water. Their skin was rubbed with bacon grease or animal fat to give it a deceptive sheen of health. The pale lines of old whip scars were covered with shoe polish or dark wax. Each person was given one clean garment, usually cheap wool for the men and bright calico for the women, to make them look presentable on the block. Then they were marched into the auction rooms, where the buyers were waiting. The buyers were southern planters in tailored coats and beaver fur top hats, fresh off the steamboats from Natchez and New Orleans, their pockets fat with banknotes drawn on Wall Street institutions. They moved through the lines of enslaved people like inspectors at a livestock fair. They pried open mouths to check tooth wear, using molars to estimate the real age. They squeezed shoulders to gauge muscle. They ran their hands across the hips of young women, calculating the future yield of their wombs. Bills of sale were signed. Stacks of currency changed hands. The ledger upstairs was updated, and a human being, who had been born with a name and a mother, was reclassified as freight in transit. There was a particular sub-market within Shockoe Bottom that operated quietly behind closed doors. It was called the fancy trade. The product was light-skinned, mixed-race young women, many of whom were the biological daughters of the very plantation owners selling them. These women were not bought for the cotton fields. They were bought to be forced concubines for the wealthiest planters and politicians of New Orleans, Natchez, and Charleston. They commanded the highest prices in the entire American slave market, sometimes 10 times the price of the strongest field hand. The buyers paid these staggering sums for one purpose: to purchase the exclusive right to commit systematic sexual violence inside the velvet-curtained bedrooms of their plantation manors, with full legal protection from the state. The titans of this industry did not stand on the auction blocks. They worked out of polished offices far above the screaming. Men like Isaac Franklin and John Armfield ran their empire out of a multi-story building in Alexandria, Virginia. They were not seen as criminals by their society. They were celebrated as captains of industry, innovators, pioneers of logistics who had cracked the problem of moving thousands of human bodies efficiently across vast distances. Their headquarters was concealed behind tall brick walls that absorbed the noise of the holding pens. Inside, the offices were elegant: imported cigars, brandy decanters, clerks in starched collars working through stacks of bills of lading. Franklin and Armfield built a private fleet of specialized cargo ships. These vessels ran scheduled coastal routes, sailing down the Atlantic seaboard, around the tip of Florida, and into the bustling ports of the Gulf. The cargo holds had been engineered to maximize human density, while keeping just enough captives alive to justify the voyage. The ships had proud, patriotic names: the Tribune, the Uncas, the Isaac Franklin. To the financiers in New York and Boston who underwrote the voyages, these were just shipping manifests: insured freight, routine cargo. The banks did not see suffering. They saw collateral. When a Virginia planter wanted to expand his breeding operation, he rarely mortgaged his land. He mortgaged the bodies that walked across it. The banks dispatched assessors who counted heads, examined teeth, recorded the names and ages of every woman of childbearing potential. Contracts were drawn. If the planter defaulted on the loan, the bank seized the people. Through foreclosure proceedings, Northern banks quietly became among the largest slaveholders in the country, all without ever setting foot on a southern plantation. The blood was inked into the ledgers of Wall Street as deeply as it was scrubbed into the floorboards of the auction houses. But the ships could not move everyone. Tens of thousands of human beings had to be transported by land. This was the overland trade, and the traders organized them into formations they called coffles. A coffle was a chained procession of human beings, moving on foot for weeks at a time, sometimes for months. Men were shackled together in pairs at the wrists. The pairs were then linked by a long iron chain that ran down the center of the column, like a spine. Within the first few days of marching, the iron wore through the skin of the wrists. The wounds festered. Flies followed the column in clouds. The women and small children walked unchained at the rear, because the traders knew they had no realistic chance of escape in unfamiliar country. Mounted guards rode alongside, carrying rifles and braided bullwhips. The route stretched from the exhausted soils of Virginia all the way down into the steaming swamps of Louisiana. Over 1,000 miles. They walked through the cold rains of early spring. They walked through the bone-soaking storms of summer. They walked through the relentless, lung-crushing heat of southern autumn. The traders demanded 20 to 30 miles per day. The sound of an approaching coffle was unmistakable. A slow, metallic clinking. Iron links scraping against iron links, dragging through dirt and gravel. To the towns along the route, that sound was not horror. It was the sound of money arriving. It was the sound of the regional economy walking past their front porches. When the coffles finally reached the markets of the Deep South, they were placed in massive brick holding pens in cities like Natchez, at the southern terminus of the Natchez Trace. There, the captives were fed heavily for a few weeks. Real food. Meat, cornbread. Enough to fill them out and restore the weight they had lost on the march. The traders needed them looking strong for the final sale. Then they were sold off, in lots or individually, to the cotton kings and sugar barons of the Deep South. The destinations they were marched into, the sugar parishes of Louisiana especially, were notorious. The work was so punishing, the heat so suffocating, the disease so relentless, that the life expectancy of a field hand on a Louisiana sugar plantation could be measured in single-digit years. Between AD 1808 and the outbreak of the Civil War, over 1 million human beings were moved through this domestic machine. It was the largest forced migration in the history of North America. It rescued the dying economy of the Upper South from total bankruptcy. It supplied the biological fuel that powered the explosive expansion of the Cotton Kingdom. The entire national economy, North and South, became tethered to the steady, calculated industrial-scale breeding and movement of these bodies. The wealth this system generated was almost beyond comprehension. It built the white-columned mansions of Tidewater, Virginia. It funded the endowments of universities, whose names today are spoken with reverence. It paid for imported French wine, English silver, Belgian lace, Chinese porcelain. The brilliant ballroom society of the antebellum South, with its waltzes and its candlelit dinners and its hand-painted fans, was suspended in mid-air above a foundation of industrialized breeding. The musicians played quadrilles in chandeliered halls, while, a few hundred yards down the dirt path, women were locked inside wooden boxes, forced to produce the capital that paid for the music. If you have come this far with me, then you are not a casual observer. You are one of us. Consider stepping into The Lineage, our channel membership club. Joining is not just a subscription, it is enlistment. You become part of the vanguard that drags these stories out of the silence and tells them with the weight they deserve. The inner circle keeps the lights on here. It gives you early access to our most intense investigations before they go public. Hit the join button. Help us keep this fire burning. The planters and the traders had built what they believed was a flawless economic machine. The ledgers balanced. The profits compounded year after year. The system seemed permanent. But there was a flaw in the design. Flesh is not iron. Flesh tears. Flesh bleeds. Flesh fails. The constant stress, the filthy conditions, the relentless cycle of forced pregnancy and abrupt weaning began to take a measurable toll on the merchandise. The breeding farms were enormously profitable, but they were also biologically unstable. Mortality rates started cutting into the margins. The businessmen behind the operation began to realize they needed something they had not yet brought into the system. They did not need crueler overseers. They did not need better whips. They needed men with diplomas. They needed scientists. They needed doctors to walk into the breeding pens. The wooden cabins where the breeding took place were starting to leak money. Every winter, planters across the Upper South watched their balance sheets bleed out. Fevers swept through the quarters. Infections spread from one dirt floor to the next. Complications from forced, rapid-fire pregnancies killed off the most valuable assets on the property. An overseer with a whip could compel a man to harvest cotton until his hands cracked open. But a leather lash was useless against a prolapsed uterus. A whip could not stop the slow internal bleeding that killed a woman 6 days after a difficult birth. A whip could not push antibodies into a feverish newborn. The men who owned these breeding farms began to recognize a critical defect in their supply chain. They needed something more sophisticated. They needed intervention from above. So they turned their gaze toward the educated class of America. They turned to the gentlemen with diplomas hanging on their walls. And the men of science came. They arrived at the plantations carrying polished leather bags. Inside those bags gleamed surgical instruments forged from imported steel. They brought with them the prestige of the lecture hall, the authority of the medical journal, the credibility of Latin terminology. But they did not come to heal. They came to perform maintenance on a piece of equipment. The patient was not the patient. The patient was the machine. The medical schools of the 19th century United States were not innocent observers of this system. They were woven into it. Universities in Virginia, in South Carolina, in Georgia, in Maryland, depended on the institution of slavery in two ways: for donations and for material. The bodies of enslaved people became the primary source for anatomical instruction and surgical practice. Medical students needed flesh to learn on. Living flesh. Dead flesh. Flesh that could not refuse, could not file a complaint, could not have a family come asking questions. The plantation owners needed their property repaired and kept productive. A quiet, mutually profitable partnership formed between the dissection theater and the auction block. Each side helped the other. Each side prospered. Consider what was happening in the backyard of a property in Montgomery, Alabama. The man working there was Dr. J. Marion Sims. For more than a century after his death, history books referred to him with reverence, the father of American gynecology. Statues of him stood in public parks. His name was carved into the cornerstones of medical buildings. But behind that polished reputation, in that quiet Alabama yard, what was actually happening was a chamber of horrors. In the mid-19th century, a particular condition was destroying the productive value of countless enslaved women. It was called vesicovaginal fistula. It happened when prolonged, obstructed childbirth tore through the tissue separating the bladder from the vaginal wall. The woman who survived such a labor was condemned to a kind of living hell. Constant pain, continuous leakage of urine, inability to control her own body. and, critically for the men who owned her, complete inability to bear another child. For a plantation owner, a woman with a fistula was a wrecked machine. Her market value cratered. She could not be sold. She could not be bred. She was, in the cold language of the ledger, a dead asset still consuming food. Sims smelled opportunity. He set up a small private hospital, built specifically for enslaved women, behind his property. Word spread among the local planters. Defective female stock was sent to him for repair. Between AD 1845 and AD 1849, Sims accumulated a small population of test subjects. 3 of their names have survived the historical erasure: Anarcha, Betsy, Lucy. They lived in wooden quarters behind the clinic. They were not patients. They were research animals. And Sims began an extended series of experimental surgeries on their bodies, trying to find a way to seal the fistulas. He did it all without anesthesia. The technology existed. Ether had recently entered the medical world and was being used in operating theaters across the country on white patients. Sims made a deliberate choice not to use it on the women in his backyard. He claimed, and the medical journals of his era backed him up, that the bodies of black women simply did not register pain in the same way white women did. It was a lie, a racial fiction constructed for a single purpose: to grant medical license to torture. Try to see the scene in that wooden building. Anarcha is forced onto an examination table. She is positioned on her hands and knees, naked, exposed. Other enslaved women, themselves prisoners, are forced to hold her down by the shoulders and legs. Sims takes a pewter spoon and bends it into a new shape, fashioning what would become the world's first crude surgical speculum. He inserts it into her body. He cuts into her vaginal walls with unsterilized scalpels. He stitches the torn tissue with silver wire, trying to find a closure that would hold. The stitches fail. The wound rips open again. Infection rushes in. She develops a raging fever. She nearly dies. When her body finally recovers enough to walk, he puts her back on the table and begins again. He performed surgery on Anarcha 30 times, 30 separate operations, 30 separate violations, all without a single drop of pain relief. He repeated this same brutal cycle on Betsy, on Lucy, on women whose names history did not even preserve. He refined his methods through agonizing trial and error, carving his career into their living organs. When at last he discovered the right silver suture technique to make the closure hold, he wrote up his findings. He published in the most respected medical journals of the time. He was crowned a pioneer. He moved his practice to New York. He opened a fashionable hospital for wealthy white women, where, suddenly, anesthesia was used without hesitation. The women in the backyard in Alabama? They were patched up, returned to their owners. They had been successfully repaired. They were once again capable of bearing children. The asset had been salvaged, the investment recovered, and Sims was not unique. He was the rule, not the exception. Across the antebellum South, doctors quietly used the enslaved population as a vast, unregulated laboratory. Down in Georgia, a physician named Thomas Hamilton developed an obsession. He wanted to prove, through experiment, that black skin was physiologically thicker than white skin, that it absorbed pain differently, that it transmitted heat differently. He believed this so-called proof would scientifically justify the use of the whip as a humane disciplinary tool. To pursue this theory, Hamilton purchased an enslaved man named John Brown. He had a pit dug into the ground. He had a cover built. He had it lined with fire bricks. It was, in effect, an oven. He placed John Brown inside that pit, kindled fires beneath it, and observed. He timed exactly how long the body could endure escalating temperatures before consciousness failed. He gave Brown enormous doses of crude medicines, inducing violent vomiting, observing the limits of what the human stomach and intestines could survive. He systematically blistered Brown's skin with chemical compounds. He applied acidic ointments directly to the raw, exposed nerves underneath. He watched. He timed. He took notes. He documented heart rate. He counted convulsions. He recorded the exact moment each man passed out. The Southern medical journals snapped up these findings. They printed them. They cited them. They built a whole pseudoscientific framework on top of them, one that classified enslaved people as a biologically distinct, somehow lesser variation of humanity, conveniently optimized by nature for backbreaking labor and tropical heat. This was the intellectual armor of the breeding farm. The doctors handed the plantation owner a hardcover textbook. The textbook told him that what he was doing was not cruelty. It was alignment with the natural order. It was science. The appetite for human material did not end with death. It only intensified. The medical colleges of Richmond, of Charleston, of Baltimore, of New Orleans needed a constant supply of cadavers for the dissection tables in their anatomy halls. White citizens guarded their cemeteries with shotguns and lanterns. The desecration of a white grave triggered riots and lynchings, so the medical schools looked elsewhere. They looked to the unmarked, unguarded graves at the back edges of plantations. They looked to the burial trenches behind the slave quarters. A shadow industry sprang up to supply them. Night doctors, the enslaved called them in whispers, passed from one cabin to the next. These were men who slipped onto plantation grounds in the small hours of the morning, carrying wooden spades to muffle the sound of their digging. They unearthed the fresh graves of recently buried enslaved men, women, and children. They wrapped the bodies in canvas. They loaded them into wagons under tarps. They drove them back to the brick anatomy buildings of the universities, where the corpses would be carved open under candlelight by aspiring physicians. Sometimes the schools did not even wait for the grave. Aging or terminally ill enslaved people were sold directly to medical institutions at deep discounts. The dying asset still generated a final return for the owner. The school received a fresh, soon-to-be cadaver to study. There are documented instances of experimental surgeries being performed on these patients while they were still alive. Doctors opened chest cavities to observe how long a heart would continue to beat when exposed to open air. They measured, they timed, they wrote it all down. The enslaved body was a commodity from the instant of conception, through every breath of forced reproduction, and straight onto the dissection slab. Even death did not end the extraction. Down in Louisiana, a physician named François-Marie Provost worked in sugar country. Sugar parishes were notorious. The work there killed people so quickly that the population could not even reproduce itself naturally. The death rate exceeded the birth rate. The planters there depended entirely on importing fresh bodies from the Virginia breeding farms. Because every new captive cost a fortune, saving a child during a difficult delivery became a financial imperative. So Provost pioneered the use of the cesarean section in America. Before the late 19th century, cutting a child out of a mother's abdomen was almost a guaranteed death sentence for the woman. It was a procedure of absolute last resort. Provost altered the calculation. He performed the operation again and again on enslaved women. He had them strapped to the table. He cut through the abdominal wall. He cut through the uterus. He pulled out the infant. The vast majority of the mothers died, days later, from massive blood loss or from sepsis. A significant percentage of the infants lived. From the plantation owner's perspective, this was an upgrade. A dead mother, but a living, saleable infant was a better outcome than losing both. The doctor collected his fee. The ledger registered the loss of the adult female, balanced by the gain of a new infant. Provost performed these procedures close to 30 times. He used the bodies of enslaved women to chart, in painstaking detail, the surgical routes through the human abdomen. The medical knowledge he generated still informs textbooks today. The names of his subjects do not. The doctors went further. When the brutal reality of slavery produced predictable human responses, the medical establishment invented diseases to explain them away. When enslaved people tried to escape, when they ran toward the woods or the rivers, a physician named Samuel Cartwright stepped forward with a diagnosis. He called the condition drapetomania. He defined it as a mental illness characterized by an irrational, pathological desire to flee captivity. The desire to be free was not a normal human impulse in Cartwright's framework. It was a sickness, and like any sickness, it required treatment. The cure he prescribed was the systematic amputation of the toes. Cripple the patient. Cure the pathology. The medical journals printed it without protest. When women on the breeding farms stopped producing children, whether because of severe malnutrition, internal injuries, or profound depression, the doctors did not look for the obvious cause. They diagnosed female hysteria. They diagnosed laziness. They prescribed forced labor regimens, harsh purgatives, and physical punishment. The possibility that a woman who had watched her last 6 children loaded onto a wagon and driven away forever might be experiencing crushing psychological grief. That grief might be shutting down her body was simply not considered. Grief, after all, was not a recognized condition in livestock. There was another phenomenon they noted with concern. Infant mortality was catastrophically high on the breeding farms. Babies frequently died in their sleep. Modern medical science would identify what was happening as sudden infant death syndrome, amplified by appalling living conditions, by damp dirt floors, by malnourished mothers with depleted milk, by the cold of unheated cabins in winter. The plantation doctors had a different explanation. They diagnosed it as smothering. They claimed the mothers were rolling over onto their infants in the night, killing them through carelessness or, in some accusations, through spite. This explanation was extremely convenient. It absolved the owner of any responsibility for the conditions he provided. It also gave him grounds to punish the grieving mother for the destruction of his property. To make the system work, the men of science understood that the body alone was not enough. The mind had to be broken too. You cannot run an industrial breeding operation on human beings who retain a sense of self, who retain family loyalty, who retain the protective instinct that every parent feels. The architecture of the breeding farm was therefore designed to dismantle the mind even before it dismantled the body. The enslaved men suffered a particular kind of psychological annihilation. The system removed from them, methodically, any capacity to protect their families. Fatherhood, as a concept, was surgically extracted. A man was made to stand still and watch his wife undergo medical inspection by the overseer and the visiting doctor. He was made to watch the trader run his hands over her, examining her teeth, her hips, her abdomen. If he moved forward, if he raised his voice, he was killed. The men who had been designated as stock men endured a horror that has rarely been spoken about. They were selected for physical traits: height, musculature, disease resistance. They were ordered to impregnate women across the plantation, sometimes across multiple plantations. This was not a position of privilege, despite later attempts to frame it that way. This was industrialized rape carried out under threat of execution. These men were forced to father dozens of children they would never raise, would never name, would never see again. Those children would be born into chains and shipped off to the sugar fields by age 8. The psychological burden of this existence broke many of them. They retreated behind walls of dissociation. They became vacant, performing biological function on command, while whatever had once been a person inside them withdrew somewhere deep and silent. The system was so refined that it generated paperwork. Real, legally binding contracts. Plantation owners drafted detailed leasing agreements with each other. A Virginia planter might lease a group of women to a neighboring estate for a 5-year term. The contract would specify, in careful legal language, the boundaries of the arrangement. The neighbor would have the right to the women's physical labor. The neighbor would have the right to feed and shelter them. But any children born to those women during the lease period? Those infants belonged, legally and absolutely, to the original owner. Sit with the logistics of that contract for a moment. The neighbor had every financial incentive to work those women to the absolute edge of physical destruction, because he had no long-term stake in their survival. Their bodies were borrowed. The original owner sent his own inspectors to check on the women's pregnancies, to count the infants, to verify the count. When the lease finally expired, the women were marched, sometimes many miles, back to the original property. They left behind, in the neighbors' quarters, children they had given birth to during the lease. They carried home with them infants, who were legally the property of a man they had not laid eyes on in 5 years. American law, written by educated men in marble buildings, treated the reproductive function of the human uterus as a severable, leasable commercial asset, like timber rights, like a strip of riverbank. In the middle of this medical and legal tyranny, a quiet resistance was forming. Inside the slave quarters, a parallel system of healthcare had taken shape. The enslaved women pushed back against the plantation doctors using the only weapons they had access to. Older women, often grandmothers past childbearing age, served as midwives and healers. They held deep encyclopedic knowledge of plants, of root medicine, of techniques for delivery and recovery. Some of that knowledge had been carried over from Africa, kept alive in oral tradition for generations. Some of it had been learned through desperate experimentation in American forests and swamps. These women worked underground. They knew exactly who the plantation doctor was working for. He was there to protect the owner's investment. He was not there for the patient. So the midwives moved in the shadows. They smuggled wild herbs into the cabins. They brewed teas from snake root, from pennyroyal, from cotton root bark. This is one of the most fiercely guarded secrets the breeding farms ever produced. Cotton root bark, brewed strong or chewed raw, functions as an abortifacient. It induces uterine contractions. It terminates pregnancies. Enslaved women used it deliberately to seize back control over their own bodies. When some of them realized they were pregnant, they made an unimaginable choice. They chose to end the pregnancy themselves rather than allow another child to be born into the machinery of the Southern economy. They chose to destroy what the owner counted as capital, in order to spare a child from the auction block they could already see waiting at the end of the road. This was rebellion at the cellular level. Quiet, devastating, and deliberate. When the overseers discovered what was happening, the retaliation was vicious. Midwives caught with cotton root were tortured. Some were sold deep south to the sugar fields, which was understood by everyone as a slow death sentence. Owners ordered thorough inspections of the cabins. They watched pregnant women eat their rations under direct supervision, ensuring no abortive herbs were consumed. The woman's body became contested territory. The womb itself became a battleground patrolled by men. And the ultimate act of resistance, the act that owners feared above almost anything else, was the simple refusal to produce the next entry in the ledger. The physical toll of forced back-to-back pregnancies destroyed these women by the time they reached their early 30s. A woman who had been made to bear 10, 12, sometimes 14 children in rapid succession, while subsisting on cornmeal and salt pork, while doing field labor through every trimester, suffered total physiological collapse. Their teeth fell out from severe calcium depletion. Their spines curved into permanent bends. Pelvic organ prolapse was common. Hernias. Chronic pelvic infections. By 35, they walked like women in their 70s. Once a woman could no longer conceive, she was reclassified. In the casual vocabulary of the overseers, she went from prime breeding stock to trash. There was no retirement. There was no easier work. She was sent into the fields to perform the most punishing physical labor that remained until her body finally gave out entirely. When she died, she was buried in an unmarked trench at the property line. Her body sometimes dug up weeks later by the night doctors. Her name was erased from every official record. Her existence vanished from the American story almost completely. The biological harvest extended past birth in another, less discussed direction. The wealthy white women of the plantation aristocracy considered the act of breastfeeding their own infants to be undignified, vulgar, even ruinous to their figures. It interrupted their visiting schedules. It interfered with their social engagements. They needed an alternative. They turned once again to the breeding pens. When an enslaved woman gave birth, and her own infant either died or was sold off immediately, her body kept producing milk. The owners did not let that biological output go unmonetized. They took these grieving mothers, women whose own arms were still aching for the child that had just been taken, and forced them into the manor house. They handed her the master's white infant. They told her to nurse it. And she did. She held the child of the man who owned her against her chest. She fed him the milk her own body had made for the baby she would never see again. The maternal drive, the most ancient programming in the human nervous system, was hijacked to sustain the next generation of the ruling class. Her milk was treated as just another agricultural product, harvested daily, free, inexhaustible until it ran dry. The medical profession also embedded itself directly into the logistics of the slave markets in Richmond, in Alexandria, in New Orleans. Before a coffle marched south, before a ship sailed for the Gulf, the traders called in certified physicians. These doctors performed humiliating physical examinations on the merchandise. They focused with particular care on the young women destined for the fancy trade. The trader needed medical certification to back the sale. The doctor checked for venereal disease, for hidden defects, for evidence of prior childbirth. He examined eyes for jaundice. He examined teeth for age estimation. He examined the reproductive organs to verify virginity. He then signed an official medical document attesting to the health and chastity of the young woman. These signed certificates were displayed at the auction houses in New Orleans, pinned to the dresses of the girls like warranty cards stuck on appliances. The signature of the physician gave the sexual commerce a clean, professional veneer. It transformed the trafficking of teenage girls into something with the appearance of a legitimate medical commercial transaction. The full record of this medical complicity is enormous. The exact details of these surgeries, the names of the doctors, the dates of these procedures, the testimony recorded in the journals they themselves published, all of it has been documented. The primary source material that lets us reconstruct this nightmare in this much detail is available right now through the View Products button visible on your screen. The book in question is a triumph of dark research. It does not flinch. It quotes directly from the doctor's own writings. It forces you to read what they actually said about the women they cut open. Own it. Read it. Let it sit on your desk. While you are there, take a moment to browse the rest of the shelf. There are immersive artifacts and dark history pieces waiting to round out your collection. Open the shop shelf on your screen. Look through these items while we continue. Let the past have a physical presence in your space. The doctors had refined the bodies. The overseers had perfected the breeding. The roads and rivers were thick with human cargo flowing south. The system was producing wealth at a scale the Western world had never seen before. But that wealth could not just sit in muddy bayous in Louisiana or in vaults in Richmond. It had to be moved. It had to be cleaned. The raw capital, extracted from human flesh, needed to be transformed into something else entirely. Into railroads, into steel mills, into shipping fleets, into the iron skeleton of the American future. The men who built the engine wore boots and rode plantations, but the men who actually owned the machine wore different suits. They lived in different cities. Their offices looked out over the harbor of New York, over the docks of Boston, over the Thames in London. They were waiting on dividends, and in their vaults, under heavy lock and key, they held the ultimate collateral: the bodies of the unborn. The dirt of the breeding farms was stained with red clay and human blood. The hands that built the Southern economy were calloused, scarred, often missing fingers. But the men who actually owned the machine never set foot in those fields. They never breathed the heavy summer air thick with sweat and rot. They sat in oak-paneled offices on Wall Street, on State Street in Boston, on Threadneedle Street in London. They wore tailored wool suits with silk linings. They drank tea from porcelain cups. They did not deal in human flesh directly. They dealt in something far more abstract. They dealt in paper. They dealt in symbols. They dealt in the financial representation of that flesh. The domestic slave trade was never just a regional agricultural curiosity. It was the foundational substrate of the modern global financial system. The bodies of the enslaved were converted into the single most powerful financial instrument the world had ever seen. To grasp the scale of this operation, you have to understand how a mortgage worked in 19th century America. The banking sector at the time was wild, fragmented, and ferociously hungry for expansion. Down in the Deep South, planters needed staggering amounts of capital. They needed money to clear cypress forests in Louisiana. They needed money to drain the swamps of the Mississippi Delta. They needed money to purchase the human beings being bred up in Virginia and Maryland. But land was cheap. Land alone could not justify the size of the loans the planters were seeking. The true value, the real collateral, was something else. It was labor. It was the bodies that worked the labor. The banks figured this out very early. They began allowing planters to mortgage their slaves. A man in Natchez could walk into a small local bank, hat in hand. He could lay a list down on the desk: names, ages, physical descriptions of every person he owned. The bank dispatched an assessor. The assessor traveled to the plantation, walked through the quarters, examined the enslaved men, the women, the children. He assigned a dollar value to each individual head. A strong field hand in his 20s might be valued at $800. A young woman of proven fertility might be valued at over $1,000. The bank took the appraised list, notarized it, sealed it, locked it inside a vault. Then they handed the planter a thick stack of paper currency. In that moment, every person on the list became collateral. If the planter missed an interest payment, the bank foreclosed. The local sheriff rode out to the property with court papers. He seized the people whose names appeared on the mortgage document. He marched them to the courthouse steps in town. He auctioned them off, one by one, to the highest bidder to satisfy the outstanding debt. Families were not shattered by the cruelty of a single owner in those moments. They were shattered by the mechanical execution of a financial contract. The bank recovered its capital. The ledger remained balanced. The lives inside it did not. But the local banks of the South did not have unlimited reserves. They could not lend forever on their own resources. They needed to borrow from larger, deeper institutions to keep the cash flowing to the planters. So they reached up the chain. They reached toward the financial capitals of the world. Banks in New Orleans and Charleston began bundling these slave mortgages together. They aggregated them. They packaged them into large debt obligations. They issued bonds backed by the value of those bundled mortgages. They created, in effect, an early version of the mortgage-backed security. The underlying asset was not real estate. The underlying asset was human flesh. They took those bonds across the Atlantic. They sold them in London. They sold them in Paris. They sold them in Amsterdam. The most prestigious investment houses of Europe, firms like Baring Brothers, bought these securities with enthusiasm. They distributed them to wealthy European clients. A retired wine merchant in a quiet townhouse in Marylebone could purchase a bond paying a stable 6% annual return. The bond was printed on heavy parchment, sealed in red wax, stamped with the seal of a southern bank he had never heard of in a state he could not have located on a map. He never saw a cotton field. He never heard a whip snap. He never watched a child torn from its mother. But the quiet, dependable interest income that funded his retirement, his French wine, his daughter's piano lessons, was generated by exactly those events occurring thousands of miles away. The interest paid on his bond was the direct financial output of forced labor in the field and forced reproduction in the breeding pens. The entire global capital market was wired, like a circulatory system, to the biological function of the Virginia breeding farms. Human life had been securitized. It was being traded on international exchanges with the same indifference as wheat futures or pig iron contracts. The Consolidated Association of the Planters of Louisiana is one of the cleanest case studies of how this worked. This institution existed for one purpose. It funneled European capital directly into the Southern slave economy. It issued millions of dollars worth of bonds. Every single one of those bonds was backed by the bodies of enslaved people working on Louisiana plantations. When the financial panic of 1837 struck, planters across the region defaulted on their loans by the hundreds. The banks staggered. The European bondholders demanded their money back. The courts ruled, predictably, that the collateral had to be liquidated to satisfy the international debt. Thousands of enslaved people were seized by the state. They were sold at massive public auctions to repay European bondholders, men who had never set foot in America. Entire communities of enslaved families were physically uprooted, scattered across the Cotton Belt, broken apart forever, to clear the books on bonds held in vaults in Amsterdam. Capital protected itself. Flesh paid the price. That has always been the equation. And the northern banks, the institutions in cities where the local newspapers thundered against slavery in moral terms, were quietly providing the credit lines that kept the entire trafficking apparatus operational. When a firm like Franklin and Armfield purchased 100 human beings in Richmond on a Tuesday morning, they did not arrive carrying chests of gold coins. They paid with drafts of credit issued by New York banks. Wall Street processed the transactions. Wall Street collected the fees. Wall Street's clerks stamped the paperwork and filed it away. Then Wall Street's executives went home to their townhouses in Manhattan and read editorials decrying the moral horror of the South. The system required risk management. Enslaved people were extremely valuable, but they were biologically fragile. They died of cholera in unsanitary cabins. They died in childbirth on dirt floors. They drowned in floodwaters. They were beaten to death by overseers who had lost their tempers. For a planter who had mortgaged dozens of workers, a single outbreak of yellow fever could mean financial ruin overnight. He would lose his collateral. He would default on his loans. The bank would seize whatever was left. The market sensed this vulnerability. And where the market senses vulnerability, the insurance industry follows. Before the Civil War, some of the largest, most respected American insurance companies were writing life insurance policies on enslaved people. Companies whose names still hang on glass towers in Manhattan today. Companies whose advertisements still appear during evening television broadcasts. New York Life, which in that era operated under the name Nautilus Insurance Company, built a meaningful portion of its early portfolio on this practice. A planter could walk into an insurance office and purchase a policy on a specific enslaved individual. The policy covered death from illness, death from accident, death from execution in some cases. The mechanics of these insurance policies reveal the absolute moral inversion at the heart of the whole system. In a normal life insurance contract, a person buys a policy to protect his family in the event of his death. The payout is meant to provide for the grieving widow, to put food on the table for the orphaned children, to keep the household afloat after a tragedy. In the slave insurance market, none of that applied. The owner bought the policy. The owner paid the premiums. When the enslaved person died, the owner collected the payout. The actual family of the dead person received nothing. They were not even informed of the existence of the policy. This created a stomach-turning incentive structure. There were specific situations in which an enslaved person was worth more to the master dead than alive. An older field hand who contracted a chronic illness and could no longer work hard had a market value that approached zero. He continued to consume food. He continued to require shelter. He produced no labor in return. He was, in the cold language of the ledger, a liability. But if the master held a $500 life insurance policy on him, his death suddenly became a profitable financial event. There are documented suspicions, and in some cases hard evidence, of enslaved people being deliberately worked to death or denied medical care precisely because their insurance payout exceeded their living value. The insurance companies employed doctors to assess risk before underwriting the policies. These physicians examined the prospective insured individuals exactly the way a modern actuary inspects a piece of industrial equipment. They listened to lungs, they palpated abdomens, they examined limbs for old injuries, they measured chest expansion. They rated risk on a scale and set the premium accordingly. The result was a fully functional, fully professionalized actuarial market built around the projected biological lifespan of enslaved human beings. When an enslaved person died, the owner submitted a claim, a signed certificate from the plantation physician stating the cause of death was required. The paperwork traveled by stagecoach or train to an office in New York or Baltimore. A clerk at a tall wooden desk reviewed the file under the light of a brass lamp. He pulled the original policy from a drawer. He verified the policy number against the master ledger. He stamped the claim approved. He drew a check made out to a Southern planter. The death of a human being in a sugar camp in Louisiana registered, to that clerk, as a routine debit entry in a corporate accounting book. He went home, ate his supper, kissed his children goodnight. The entire American legal system had been mobilized to defend this property right. Human beings were classified, in the language of the courts, as chattel. The word carries weight. It is a precise legal term. It means personal, movable property. It places enslaved people inside the same legal category as cattle, as wagons, as items of furniture. And like cattle and wagons, they could be taxed. Every county across the South employed tax assessors. These men spent their working days riding from one farm to the next on horseback. They counted acres of cleared land. They counted horses in the stables. They counted enslaved human beings in the quarters. They assigned each one a taxable value. The local governments levied annual taxes based on the appraised total of this human property. That tax revenue funded the infrastructure of the southern states. It paid for the construction of dirt roads. It paid for the wooden bridges. It built the courthouses where the laws were enforced. It paid the salaries of the judges who passed sentences on fugitive slaves. It paid the sheriffs who hunted those fugitives through swamps with dogs. The entire system of state oppression that crushed the enslaved population was financed by tax revenue calculated from the assessed dollar value of the very bodies being oppressed. The government was structurally, financially dependent on the perpetuation of the breeding farms. Abolition was not just a moral threat, it was a fiscal catastrophe. The chattel classification dictated the rules of inheritance as well. Wealth in the 19th century moved between generations through wills and probate courts. When a wealthy planter died, his estate was carved up among his heirs. His will explicitly enumerated his human property. A man might leave 300 acres of pine forest to his eldest son. He might leave 10 shares of railroad stock to his younger brother. And he might leave a young, fertile, enslaved woman named Hannah to his 17-year-old daughter as a wedding gift. The gift of a human being was considered, in the polite society of the time, the highest expression of paternal devotion. It guaranteed that the daughter would have a reliable, lifelong source of income. The woman would breed. Her children would belong to the daughter. The daughter could sell those children, one by one, to finance her education, her trousseau, her own first home, her European tour. The reproductive biology of the enslaved woman underwrote the financial independence of the white heiress. One body produced the freedom of another. That was how it worked. That was how a society of fine manners and embroidered handkerchiefs sustained itself. When a planter died deeply in debt, the probate court took over. A judge ordered the estate liquidated to satisfy creditors. The land went to auction. The silver and china went to auction. And the enslaved people were dragged to the courthouse square. Probate sales were notorious throughout the South for their brutality. An owner who had been alive might have kept families together for sentimental reasons or simply to maintain morale on the property. The probate court possessed no sentiment whatsoever. The legal mandate was clear: maximize the financial return to the creditors. The auctioneer broke families apart with surgical precision. He sold the father to a buyer from Texas. He sold the mother to a buyer headed to Georgia. He sold the children, one by one, to bidders from across the county and from out of state. The law required the highest possible aggregated price. Selling a family as a single unit usually fetched less money than selling each member individually. So the law mandated the destruction of the family. It was not cruelty, it was statute. By the year AD 1860, the total estimated financial value of the enslaved population in the United States stood at approximately $3 billion. Pause on that figure. $3 billion in 19th century currency. That number exceeded the combined value of every railroad, every factory, every steamship, and every bank in the entire United States. The bodies of roughly 4 million human beings represented the single largest financial asset class in the American economy. Larger than industry, larger than infrastructure, larger than the financial sector itself. This is the context the textbooks rarely provide for the Civil War. The conflict was not a quiet philosophical debate about constitutional theory and states' rights. It was a war fought over the preservation of a $3 billion asset class. The Southern elite understood, with brutal clarity, that the election of Abraham Lincoln threatened the future expansion of their economic model. If they could not expand westward into the new territories, the value of their human capital would eventually plateau, then decline. The wealthiest men in the South chose to set fire to the country rather than allow their portfolios to depreciate. The war was, in a very literal sense, an asset protection strategy. When the North finally won the war, the institution of chattel slavery was legally abolished. The 13th Amendment was ratified in AD 1865. 4 million people walked, in a single legislative stroke, off the plantations into freedom. From a financial standpoint, this was the largest uncompensated liquidation of private property in the entire history of the world. $3 billion in collateral evaporated overnight. The Southern economy disintegrated. Plantation mansions decayed. Estates that had stood for generations went under the auctioneer's hammer. But the capital that had been extracted from those bodies over the previous 60 years did not vanish with them. That capital had already been moved. The millions upon millions of cotton bales picked by enslaved hands had already been sold to English textile mills. The profits had already been deposited in banks in New York, in Boston, in Philadelphia. That money had already been put to work financing the Industrial Revolution of the North. It had laid the iron rails that connected the East Coast to the Midwest. It had built the textile mills of Lowell, Massachusetts. It had funded the endowments of universities whose names today are synonymous with American intellectual prestige. The blood was scrubbed from the money. The money built the modern American economy. The South was left a wasteland. The planters still owned vast tracts of land, but they no longer owned a labor force. They needed to find a way to rebuild the engine without the legal architecture of chattel slavery. They began searching the new constitutional landscape for a loophole. They found one. It was hiding in plain sight, buried inside the very amendment that was supposed to have ended slavery. The 13th Amendment reads that neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist within the United States, except as a punishment for crime. Those 8 words, except as a punishment for crime, became the architectural blueprint for a new system of extraction. The Southern states moved quickly. They began rewriting their criminal codes immediately after the war. They passed waves of new statutes known as the Black Codes, and shortly after, the Pig Laws and the Vagrancy Laws. These laws were carefully designed to criminalize the simple act of existing while black in the post-war South. If a black man was found walking along a country road without documented proof of employment, he could be arrested for vagrancy. If he spoke too loudly in a public square, he could be arrested for disturbing the peace. If he could not pay the deliberately exorbitant fines handed down by the local magistrate, he was sentenced to months or years of hard labor in the state penitentiary. The system caught people the way a net catches fish. It was designed to. It worked exactly as intended. The prisons filled to overflowing within months. The Southern states, financially gutted by the war, had no money to construct new facilities. So they engineered a savage and innovative solution. They invented the convict lease system. They began leasing their prisoners directly to private corporations. A coal mining company in Alabama or a railroad contractor in Tennessee could pay the state a monthly fee for every prisoner provided. The state collected enormous revenue. The corporation received a captive, fully controllable workforce. The prisoner received a pickaxe and a length of iron chain. The convict lease system was, in measurable terms, more lethal than chattel slavery had ever been. Under the old system, an enslaved person was an expensive long-term asset. A prime field hand cost over $1,000 at auction. The owner therefore had a financial incentive to keep that asset alive long enough to recover the investment. Cold incentive, but at least an incentive. Under the convict lease system, the corporation did not own the prisoner. The corporation rented him from the state for a few dollars a month. The prisoner represented zero capital investment. He was therefore 100% disposable. If a prisoner was crushed in a mine collapse, or contracted dysentery in a swamp work camp, or died of heat stroke breaking rocks in the August sun, the corporation suffered no measurable financial loss. They simply sent a telegram to the state warden requesting a replacement body to be delivered on the next train. The mortality rates in the convict lease camps were apocalyptic. Men were sent down into the coal mines of Alabama with no safety equipment, no training, no medical care. They were forced to extract enormous daily quotas of coal. If they failed to meet the quota, they were strapped over a wooden barrel and whipped with a leather strap until their backs opened. In certain camps, the death rate exceeded 20% annually. 1 in 5 men, dead within a year. The bodies of the dead were often burned inside the coke ovens, conveniently disposing of the evidence, or buried in shallow, unmarked graves in the surrounding pine forests. Entire corporate empires were built on this leased labor. The Tennessee Coal, Iron, and Railroad Company, which was eventually absorbed by U.S. Steel, used thousands upon thousands of convicts to rip iron ore out of the Alabama hills. They built the industrial city of Birmingham, Alabama, on the broken backs of men whose only crime had been walking down a road without a job offer in their pocket. Mississippi went a different direction. The state purchased an enormous tract of fertile land in the Delta region. They named it Parchman Farm. It was officially a state penitentiary, but in every practical sense, it operated as a massive antebellum plantation. The prisoners, overwhelmingly black men, were forced to pick cotton from sunrise to sunset, under the rifles of mounted guards. The state extracted millions of dollars in profit from the cotton fields. That money funded the state government. The state government, in turn, funded the system that kept the prisoners on Parchman. In Louisiana, the state purchased a former slave breeding plantation called Angola. They converted it into the Louisiana State Penitentiary. They kept the land. They kept the crops. They kept the forced labor. They simply changed the official designation of the workers from slave to inmate. The physical location of the horror did not even change. The same fields, the same sun, the same brutal pace of work. The men simply traded iron chains for iron bars. Angola is still operational today. It is still the largest maximum security prison in the United States. It still sits on the same plantation land. The legacy of the ledger is not a ghost story. It is not a metaphor. It is the actual concrete you walk on. It is the institutional wealth visible on the balance sheets of the largest banks in the world. The transition from breeding farm to auction block to mortgage-backed security to convict lease camp to modern prison industrial complex is one continuous, unbroken line of financial optimization. The men who built and maintained this system did not understand themselves as monsters. They understood themselves as practical men, as pragmatists, as efficiency experts. They looked at a human being and saw only an input cost and a projected yield. If you want to understand the architecture of modern wealth, you cannot stop at the marble columns and the polished corporate mission statements. You have to dig down past the foundation. You have to push your hand into the soil. You have to go down to where the dirt is still rich with calcium from pulverized bone. The American economic machine was not built by the invisible hand of free markets. It was built by the heavy, blood-darkened hand of the overseer, guided by the precise, unblinking pen of the accountant. The ledger was never destroyed in 1865. It was simply digitized. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. We do not sanitize history on this channel. We do not look away from what actually happened. If you believe these stories need to be told the way they happened, hit that subscribe button right now. Like the video to push it through the algorithm and put it in front of more people. Share this specific episode with somebody in your life who still thinks history is just dates in a textbook. Make them see what the textbooks left out. You have just watched another premium documentary by Ancestral, your ultimate history hub on YouTube. Click the video appearing on your screen right now. It takes you deeper into the machinery of power. Keep walking down this path. The past is not dead. It is waiting for you.